Welcome to the Invite Health podcast, where our degreed healthcare professionals are excited to offer you the most important health and wellness information you need to make informed choices about your health. You can learn more about the products discussed in each of these episodes and all that Invite Health has to offer at www.invitehealth.com/podcast. First-time customers can use promo code podcast at checkout for an additional 15% off your first purchase. Let's get started.
You may have heard of the term silent disease or silent killer, and these are terms that are kind of thrown around in the medical community when referencing disease states that people walk around with and are completely unaware until something goes haywire. So when we think about the silent killer, we're usually thinking in the setting of high blood pressure, hypertension, which can clearly then lead to potential heart attack. And when we talk about a silent disease, we are generally referencing osteoporosis because for the most part, people have no idea that their bones are getting weaker. You generally just don't feel this. And when it comes to bone health, there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what's actually happening within the bones and who is impacted by loss of bone density. So I want to talk about that today. I am Amanda Williams, MD, MPH, and let's get right to it. Let's talk about bone health in general, talking about osteoporosis, which is coined the silent disease because, as I mentioned, you cannot feel that your bones are getting weaker. Now, the reason why this is so relevant is because when we look at the millions of Americans who actually have osteoporosis or bone loss, it's roughly probably 10 to 15 million Americans. Now, there's another close to 50 million Americans who have low bone density. So when we look at the population as a whole, we can then say that probably half of the people over the age of 50 years old are at risk of breaking a bone and should really be cognizant about their bone health. Now, when we think about bone health, many times our brain right away goes to calcium and vitamin D. And of course, these are very important. These are integral to maintaining the health of the bone. But there are so many other factors that we can look at. We can look at different risks as to why people may have higher rate of bone turnover compared to others. And certainly bone loss is not just isolated to postmenopausal women, which is also a common thought that just women are affected by this. And that's certainly not the case. We know that men are really at a great risk as well. It's 1 in 4 men will break a bone in their lifetime due to bone loss or to osteoporosis. So when we're thinking about the different risk factors, clearly we know that hormones play a role into this. So postmenopausal women, of course, do have a higher rate of bone turnover because of the loss of estrogen. We can look at just the aging process in and of itself, which is why I said probably 50% of Americans over the age of 50 are at that greater risk. And this includes men and women. We can look at obesity. We can certainly look at being sedentary because we know that regular exercise, weight-bearing exercise, muscle strengthening exercise is integral to maintaining the underlying skeleton. We can certainly look at other hormonal imbalances. We can look at thyroid dysfunction. We can look at insulin resistance and diabetes, metabolic syndrome. And we can clearly see the link between low intake of certain vitamins and minerals that go beyond the scope of calcium and vitamin D. And this is really very important. We can look how easy it is to actually maintain good bone density throughout our lives. And it really comes down to diet and exercise. And we oftentimes live in a world of reactive medicine as opposed to proactive lifestyle modification. So we know that eating a healthy diet, adhering to a Mediterranean diet, all of these things are incredibly important. Making sure that we are maintaining the muscles, because remember, you have your muscles and then underneath the muscles are the bones. So maintaining good muscle tone and muscle strength certainly plays an essential role into this. Now, there's also osteopenia. I just wanted to mention this because I had talked about osteoporosis being the silent disease, but we definitely know that before you get to osteoporosis, you have what is known as osteopenia. So this is the early onset of bone loss. So when we look at what we can be doing outside of calcium and vitamin D, which is interesting because this is the one area that traditional doctors will actually get involved in when it comes to vitamins and supplements, and they usually tell people to take calcium and vitamin D. Usually it's not the right amount. Usually it's too much calcium and not enough vitamin D and not taking it at the right time. I always advise taking your calcium supplementation that's outside of what you get from your diet. Taking that in the evening, bone absorption seems to be much more efficient at night, and a lot of this has to do with the pineal gland in the brain. So when we think about the uptake of different nutrients, a lot of this is controlled via different systemic regulation that is actually from the brain itself. But we can look at other nutrients besides the calcium and vitamin D. We can look at collagen. We know that collagen provides that essential tensile strength. So it allows for that flexibility within the bones. You don't want your bones to be hard and rigid because then they're more likely to snap, for lack of a better word. We certainly know that omega-3 fatty acids play a key role. We can look at tocotrienols. We know that the omega-3s as well as tocotrienols both are very beneficial for fending off oxidative stress that can do damage. We know that the EPA and DHA that comes from things like fish oil and krill oil are really important when it comes to enhancing bone forming cells. So there are many things that diet-wise, when you just think about your diet, if you are getting adequate omega-3s, if you are getting adequate vitamins and minerals, you're usually covering most of those bases. However, we know that most Americans are just not eating healthy enough to actually achieve these things. Interesting study that came out showing the importance of things like vitamin K2. But remember, vitamin K2 is very essential for partnering up with calcium to make sure that calcium has an easier means to making its way into the bone for reuptake for that bone remineralization. But we can also look at things such as glucosamine. Many times when we think of glucosamine or chondroitin, we're thinking only in the setting of joint health, but we certainly now recognize that the glucosamine is playing a really important role when it comes to maintaining, once again, our bone density. And when it comes to partnering up with collagen, glucosamine is going to give you kind of that double effect in terms of bone health at the same time giving the benefit when it comes to joint health. So a lot of different ways in which we can assess the overall health of our bones when it comes to our diet, when it comes to our exercise routine, but also you can always go in and do a bone density test and see. Now, here's an interesting point to be made. Oftentimes people will be put on prescribed medications which come with their own slew of side effects and oftentimes are not worth taking because of the side effects that go along with them when targeting osteoporosis. But if we just start to make those dietary modifications and we start to do even, moderate exercise, and we include in those key minerals, having things like magnesium and boron, for example, we know that those are important. You have to have boron when it comes to the remineralization once again, and to help to strengthen the bones. And most people are not getting adequate boron exposure when it comes to their dietary intake. So we can look at the bone powder, for example, which we know is very comprehensive to include things such as your vitamin K2, your calcium, your vitamin D, but it also contains boron and magnesium. So this is a really great way for you to reestablish those key vitamins and minerals to help to optimize your bone health. Now, we can also think outside of that box once again and think about the impact of advanced glycation end products and how much damage those AGEs actually create when it comes to bone loss, which is when we would then start to think along those lines of the tocotrienols, thinking about things such as resveratrol. These are all very important nutrients that help to fend off advanced glycation end product that can really do significant amount of damage to the underlying bone. Now, if there are health conditions that are kind of running rampant in the body, if you have uncontrolled glucose, if you have thyroid dysfunction, any type of chronic disease that's driving up inflammation is going to do further damage to the bones itself. And then obviously looking at sex hormones, that certainly can play a significant role or indication for your overall risk for increased bone turnover. So, doing comprehensive blood testing, doing a bone density test are always beneficial, but we also just want to be proactive and think, what are the things that I need to have, that I know I need to have? So I know I need to have calcium, vitamin D, zinc is beneficial, magnesium is beneficial. So all the things that we know are already beneficial, even when we think about immune health, are also beneficial for bone health. So the bone powder is a really good place to get started for just comprehensive across the board bone support, but then we can add other nutrients on top of that. Even things like lysine, for example, they did a really interesting study in postmenopausal women, and they found that when they gave these women just 500 milligrams of lysine every day, that this did a really good job when it came to the intestinal absorption of dietary calcium. So if your intestines aren't properly taking in the calcium that you're eating from your foods, then that calcium is not ever going to make its way to the bones. So they found that lysine actually helps to enhance the ability for the intestines to actually uptake that calcium. So that's a real interesting study that was done in postmenopausal women. It was just 500 milligrams of lysine per day. So this is another area that I oftentimes will tell people would be worthwhile looking into, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is make sure that our bones are strong and healthy through the aging process, and anything that we can do in terms of our own modifications, such as our diet, such as our exercise, and taking the right supplements is going to be beneficial at the end of the day. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in to the Invite Health podcast. Remember, you can find all of our episodes for free wherever you listen to podcasts or by visiting invitehealth.com/podcast. Now do make sure that you subscribe and you leave us a review. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and we will see you next time for another episode of the Invite Health podcast.